August 1945. The world was holding its breath, caught in the silent, incandescent aftermath of a fire that had consumed nations. For a small, isolated group of women, the world had not just paused, it had shattered. They were the remnants of the Ketsugo Butai, an elite female auxiliary corps of the Imperial Japanese Army, a testament to the fusion of ancient samurai code and the stark, modern ideology of their Nazi coalition partners. Now they were prisoners. The dry, alien air of the American desert felt like the dust of their own incinerated empire, a gritty film coating their tongues and spirits. They huddled together in the back of a canvas-covered truck, the jolting journey a monotonous percussion marking the end of everything they had ever known. Their faces, etched with the grime of battle and the pallor of malnutrition, were masks of stoic defiance. They had been taught that capture was the ultimate dishonor, a state worse than death. They had been schooled in the barbarism of the enemy, the Americans, the soft, decadent, and monstrously cruel Oni who would subject them to unimaginable torumumkan. They expected torture not as a possibility, but as a grim certainty, a final trial to test the purity of their Yamato-damashii, the Japanese spirit. Their leader, First Lieutenant Akiko Tanaka, sat ramrod straight, her gaze fixed on the frayed canvas flap that offered only glimpses of a bleached, endless sky. Akiko was a vessel of the state's will, her mind a fortress built of propaganda and unyielding duty. She saw her captors not as men, but as caricatures from the posters plastered across Tokyo. Lazy, overweight, their eyes devoid of the spiritual clarity that defined her people. They were a force of crude matter, a tidal wave of steel and explosive power that had, through sheer brute force, eroded the divine shores of their homeland. She and her women were prepared for the worst physical depravity. They had mentally rehearsed the seppuku they could not physically perform, their minds turning over the imagined blades that would grant them an honorable exit from a dishonorable world. They were ready to starve, to be beaten, to be broken on the rack of enemy hatred. Their bodies were mere instruments of the Emperor's will, and in their final moments they would prove the superiority of their spirit over the enemy's flesh. They had been forged in the crucible of hardship, taught that suffering was a virtue and that deprivation sharpened the soul. They were, in their own minds, the last guardians of a sacred flame in a world rapidly plunging into darkness. The truck ground to a halt, and the canvas was thrown back, flooding their dim world with a light so brilliant it was painful. The heat washed over them, a physical blow. Before them stood not a dungeon or an execution ground, but a sprawling, orderly camp of wooden barracks laid out in a precise grid under the indifferent blue sky. The geometry of the place was itself alien. So much space, so much order. There were no screams, no jeering crowds. The American guards who motioned for them to dismount did so with an air of weary professionalism, their movements economical, their faces unreadable. This initial silence, this lack of overt malice, was the first unsettling note in a symphony of cognitive dissonance that was about to begin. It was a deviation from the script they had memorized, a moment of profound and terrifying uncertainty. They were prepared for a theater of cruelty, but they had entered a realm of incomprehensible normalcy. But they knew this was merely the prelude, a psychological tactic designed to soften them before the real horrors began. The calm was a lie, the order a facade for the chaos that surely lurked beneath. If this glimpse into the clash of ideologies has captured your imagination, consider subscribing to our channel for more stories that challenge the black and white narratives of history. The processing was methodical, impersonal, and deeply unnerving. They were stripped of their tattered uniforms, their last connection, to the identity they had fought and bled for. They were herded into a concrete building that smelled sharply of disinfectant, a scent so clean it was offensive to their senses, accustomed as they were to the metallic tang of blood and the earthy smell of dugout shelters. Under the watch of stone-faced female military police, they were subjected to showers. The water that cascaded over their emaciated bodies was not the cold, shocking torrent they expected, but a stream of impossible, decadent warmth. Hot water, an endless supply of it. They stood frozen beneath the spray, the sensation both of profound comfort and a deep ideological violation. In Japan, hot water was a luxury reserved for the privileged or for special occasions, rationed with painstaking care. Here, it was dispensed with the casual indifference of a limitless resource. Akiko watched her women, their faces a mixture of shock and shame as the grime of the battlefield was washed away, replaced by the stinging cleanliness of this new world. It felt like a baptism into impurity, a stripping away of their honorable suffering. They were given new clothes, simple, coarse cotton shifts and trousers, stiff and unfamiliar against their skin. The fabric was rough, but it was whole, without a single patch or tear. They were then led to a mess hall, a long, cavernous building, filled with the clatter of metal trays and a low hum of voices. The air was thick with the smells of cooking food, not the thin, watery miso soup or the meager rice balls of their final months of fighting, but the rich, complex aroma of roasted meat, baking bread, and something else, something sweet and foreign. They were handed metal trays and guided along a serving line. The American servers, themselves prisoners of a different sort, perhaps German or Italian, piled food onto their trays with mechanical efficiency. A slab of meatloaf, a scoop of mashed potatoes with a ladle of brown gravy, a pile of green beans, and 2 slices of bread so white and fluffy it looked like a cloud. For these women, who had subsisted on a diet scientifically designed for mere survival, this was a feast of obscene proportions. They sat at long wooden tables, their trays before them like pagan offerings. They did not eat. They stared at the food, suspicion warring with the primal, gnawing hunger that had been their constant companion for years. This had to be the trick. The food was poisoned or drugged. It was a classic interrogation technique. Lull the prisoner with a semblance of comfort, then exploit the resulting weakness. Akiko subtly shook her head, a barely perceptible motion that communicated a clear order to her subordinates. Do not touch it. They would show their captors that the Japanese spirit could not be bought with a piece of meat. They would starve with honor rather than feast in shame. The minutes ticked by. The American guards watched them, not with menace, but with a kind of detached curiosity. One of the guards, a young man with a face full of freckles, walked over to their section. He did not speak, but he picked up a tray, sat down at the end of a nearby table, and began to eat the exact same food. He ate with a healthy, uncomplicated appetite, demonstrating with every bite that the meal was not a vessel of death, but simply dinner. The sight of him eating so casually, so normally, was more disorienting than any threat. It was a quiet, irrefutable piece of evidence that contradicted their deepest fears. The poison wasn't in the food. The poison was the kindness itself, a subtle acid designed to dissolve their will. Join our community of history enthusiasts by hitting the like button if you appreciate these detailed reconstructions of pivotal, personal moments in global conflicts. Slowly, hesitantly, driven by a hunger that transcended ideology, one of the younger women, Hana, picked up her fork. Her hands trembled. She looked at Akiko for permission, but the lieutenant's face was an unreadable mask of conflict. Hana's gaze fell to her tray. She had seen her comrades die of dysentery, of infected wounds, of starvation. What was one more death, if this was to be her end? She took a small bite of the mashed potatoes. Her eyes widened. The texture was smooth, creamy, rich, with a flavor she couldn't name. Butter. It was a taste from a half-forgotten childhood, a ghost on her tongue. She took another bite, this time of the meatloaf. It was savory, dense, and utterly, shockingly delicious. A single, silent tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but of a profound and devastating confusion. One by one, the other women began to eat. They ate with a silent, desperate intensity, not speaking, not looking at each other. They were simultaneously sated and starved, their bodies nourished, while their spirits were thrown into a state of profound famine. The certainty that had been their armor was beginning to crack. But it was what came after the meal that would serve as the true catalyst for their psychological unraveling. A different cart was wheeled out from the kitchen. On it were small white paper cups. An American officer, a woman with a kind but firm face, approached their tables. Through a translator, a Nisei, a Japanese American whose very existence was a paradox to them, she explained that this was a dessert. Ice cream. The words meant nothing to most of them. It was a foreign concept, a sound without meaning. The cups were distributed. Inside each was a pristine white mound of a frozen substance. They stared at it, this bizarre, cold offering. It looked like snow, but it smelled faintly of vanilla and sugar. They watched as the American guards received their own cups, dipping their spoons in with relish. There was no hesitation. This was normal for them. This was an everyday occurrence. Hana, emboldened by her survival of the main course, was the first to try it. She dipped her spoon into the frozen cream. It resisted slightly, then yielded. She brought the spoon to her lips. The sensation was an explosion. It was a shock of intense, overwhelming cold, followed by a wave of smooth, luxurious sweetness that coated her entire mouth. It was unlike anything she had ever experienced. The flavors were simple: cream, sugar, vanilla. But in her world of deprivation, it was the most complex and decadent thing she had ever tasted. Her mind, conditioned for bitterness and hardship, struggled to process the signal. This was not food for sustenance. This was food for pleasure. The very concept was anathema to their wartime ethos. Pleasure was a weakness, a corrupting influence of the decadent West. And yet, the sensation was undeniable. It was pure, unadulterated delight. She took another spoonful, and then another, the cold making her teeth ache, the sweetness a dizzying rush. The other women watched her, their faces a tapestry of disbelief and curiosity. Tentatively they followed her lead. A strange silence fell over the mess hall, broken only by the soft clicking of spoons against paper cups. For these soldiers, hardened by a brutal war and an even more brutal ideology, this simple dessert was a weapon more potent than any bomb. The experience was so profoundly alien that their first instinct was to reject it, not just as food, but as a concept. It had to be another lie. What happens when a lifetime of belief is shattered by a single, simple act of kindness? If you want to explore more such stories, make sure to ring the notification bell. The days that followed did not bring the expected escalation of cruelty. Instead, they brought a relentless, soul-crushing wave of systemic normality. The clean barracks, the warm showers, the abundant food, these were not a one-time trick. They were the unyielding reality of their new existence. Every morning they were woken not by a screaming guard, but by a distant bugle call. They were given simple tasks to perform around the camp: laundry, cleaning, tending to small vegetable gardens. The work was light, the hours structured. There was no forced labor, no beatings for insubordination. The guards maintained a professional distance, their interactions governed by a set of rules and regulations that seemed to prioritize order and efficiency over malice. This structured, passionless humanity was, in its own way, more terrifying than the honest brutality they had anticipated. Brutality they could understand. It was a contest of wills, a struggle they could spiritually oppose. But this was a system, and it was a system that worked with a quiet, humming confidence that bespoke immense, unseen power. Their minds, trained in the art of endurance and suspicion, worked tirelessly to find the deception in it all. Akiko would gather her women in the evenings, in the sliver of shade behind their barracks, and they would dissect the day's events, searching for the enemy's true motive. The plentiful food, she argued, was designed to make them soft, to dull the sharp edge of their spirit. The medical care, a doctor had treated one of the women for a badly infected cut with penicillin, a miracle drug they had only heard of in whispers, was a form of intelligence gathering, a way to study their bodies, to find their weaknesses. The books they were given, translated copies of American novels and history texts, were riddled with subtle propaganda, designed to poison their minds with insidious Western ideas of individualism and democracy. They built a fortress of cynicism around themselves, reinforcing their old beliefs with new interpretations of the evidence before them. They were clinging to a familiar narrative in a world that refused to conform to its plot. But the evidence was relentless. One afternoon, a truck arrived at the camp's supply depot, and the women, working in a nearby garden, watched as it was unloaded. It was a river of abundance: crates of canned peaches, sacks of flour and sugar, sides of beef, wheels of cheese, and, to their utter astonishment, dozens of large, insulated containers. Later that day, at the evening meal, they were once again served ice cream. This time it was a different flavor, chocolate. The sheer casual logistics of it were staggering. That a nation could afford to not only produce such a luxury in the midst of a global war, but also transport it, refrigerated, to a remote prison camp in the middle of a desert for the benefit of its enemies. It was an act of economic and industrial might that defied their comprehension. Their own nation was melting down temple bells for ammunition and asking its citizens to subsist on acorns. The contrast was not just stark, it was an existential indictment. The chocolate ice cream was even more shocking than the vanilla, a deeper, richer flavor that spoke of a world overflowing with resources they could not even imagine. This constant exposure to a reality so contrary to their indoctrination was not a swift blow, but a slow, grinding pressure on the foundations of their worldview. If you find the psychological aspects of warfare as compelling as we do, please share this video with others who might appreciate this unique perspective. The cognitive dissonance began to manifest in physical ways. Some women suffered from nightmares, not of battle, but of vast, gleaming American supermarkets they had only seen in confiscated magazines, their shelves groaning with an impossible variety of goods. Others fell into a listless depression, the will to maintain their ideological defiance slowly draining away in the face of this overwhelming, quiet reality. Akiko found it increasingly difficult to maintain discipline. Her lectures on spiritual purity and the honor of the homeland began to sound hollow, even to her own ears, when delivered to women who were, for the first time in years, not hungry. How could she speak of the superiority of their Spartan existence when the evidence of a more comfortable, more efficient, and, dare they think it, more powerful way of life was all around them? The very ground they stood on, the food they ate, the clothes they wore, all served as a constant, silent refutation of everything they had been taught to believe. They began to truly observe their captors. They watched the young guards playing baseball in their off hours, their movements relaxed and joyful. They heard them laughing, complaining about the heat, talking about their sweethearts back home. The propaganda had painted them as subhuman monsters, as cowardly thugs who hid behind their machines. But the reality was far more disturbing. They were just ordinary men. They were not possessed of a demonic hatred, nor were they paragons of martial virtue. They were products of a different system, a system that allowed them to be casually, effortlessly human, even in the midst of war. They followed orders, did their jobs, and seemed to hold no particular personal animosity towards their prisoners. This lack of hatred was the most confusing part. The Japanese war effort was fueled by a carefully cultivated, white-hot hatred for the enemy. To find that this hatred was not reciprocated was like punching a ghost. It left them off balance, their own righteous fury feeling misplaced and suddenly terribly foolish. The deepest fissure in their collective psyche opened when they started to compare this new reality, not to the propaganda, but to their own lived experience. Chio, a quiet woman who had served as a quartermaster, possessed a mind for logistics and numbers. She would watch the supply trucks and do the math in her head. The sheer caloric intake of each prisoner, the amount of fuel used, the resources expended on medical supplies and camp maintenance. It was a level of logistical excellence that their own army, even at the height of its power, could barely have managed for its frontline troops, let alone for prisoners. They had been told that their own people's ability to endure hardship, the spirit of gammon, was their greatest weapon. They had starved, marched, and fought in conditions that would have broken lesser men. They took a grim pride in their suffering. But now a terrible thought began to creep into their minds. What if gammon was not a strength but a symptom of a fundamental weakness? What if their celebrated ability to endure scarcity was simply a consequence of their nation's inability to produce abundance? The Americans, it seemed, had not won by being better soldiers or having a stronger spirit. They had won by creating a system that made such spiritual trials irrelevant. The weight of this realization was crushing, a burden far heavier than any physical hardship they had ever endured. We delve into stories like this every week. By subscribing and turning on notifications, you ensure you won't miss our next exploration into the hidden corners of history. This constant grinding comparison between the American reality and their own memories began to eat away at their sense of self. They remembered the last days in the Pacific, the gnawing hunger that was a physical presence, a creature living inside them. They remembered making soup from boiled leather straps and weeds. They remembered the faces of their comrades, gaunt and hollow-eyed, their bodies slowly consumed by their own failing war machine. They had been told that these sacrifices were beautiful, that they were forging their spirits into pure, hard steel. They were the spiritual inheritors of the samurai, for whom deprivation was a path to enlightenment. That belief had been the bedrock of their identity, the justification for every horror they had endured and inflicted. Now, sitting in the shade of a wooden barracks, their stomachs full of meatloaf and their palates still tingling with the memory of sweet cold cream, that bedrock was turning to sand. The humiliation was a slow poison. It was not the sharp, clean humiliation of defeat in battle, but a deeper, more corrosive shame. They felt a profound sense of pity, not for themselves as prisoners, but for themselves as they had been, ignorant, arrogant, and so tragically, fatally wrong. They had sneered at the Americans' materialism, their worship of comfort and convenience. They had believed their own spiritual poverty to be a sign of strength. Now they saw that the Americans' material wealth was not a weakness, but the very source of their power. It was the foundation upon which their entire war effort was built. A nation that could provide ice cream to its prisoners was a nation that could build fleets of aircraft carriers and armadas of bombers with the same casual, terrifying efficiency. Their own nation's focus on spirit over matter was not a noble philosophy, it was a desperate gamble made by a country that had nothing else to wager. The envy they felt was a bitter, shameful thing. It was not just envy for the food or the comfort, but for the sense of possibility that seemed to permeate this place. They saw it in the guards' easy camaraderie, in the well-stocked infirmary, in the sheer, unapologetic abundance of it all. It was the envy of the terminally ill for the healthy. They had been raised in a culture of scarcity, both material and emotional. Their lives were circumscribed by duty, by obligation, by the constant crushing pressure of the collective. The Americans, even in the rigid structure of a military camp, seemed to possess a degree of personal freedom, an inner space that was utterly alien to them. This quiet, unassuming display of a different way of being was a more powerful indictment of their own society than any lecture or propaganda pamphlet could ever be. They were not just prisoners of war, they were prisoners of a failed ideology, and for the first time they could see the walls of their own cage. The most difficult emotion to process was a grudging, unwilling respect. They had been trained to see the enemy as incompetent and weak, a nation of shopkeepers and farmers who lacked the warrior spirit. But the evidence of their competence was everywhere. It was in the precise scheduling of the camp's routines, the quality of the medical care, the reliability of the supply chain. This was not the work of a decadent, crumbling society. This was the work of a nation that was organized, powerful, and frighteningly self-assured. Their defeat, they were beginning to understand, was not a fluke or a consequence of a few tactical errors. It was the inevitable result of a collision between two fundamentally different worlds. They had brought swords of spirit to a gunfight of industrial production, and they had been utterly, comprehensively vanquished before the first battle had even been joined. The history of humanity is filled with these moments of profound revelation. If you want to support our mission to uncover and share them, please consider joining our Patreon through the link in the description. The psychological transformation was not sudden, but gradual, an erosion of certainty like a cliff face worn down by a relentless tide. Each day brought new evidence, new comparisons, new cracks in the fortress of their beliefs. They learned a few words of English from the Nisei translator and the guards. Please. Thank you. More. The simple act of using these words was a small surrender, an admission that they were now operating within a new system, under new rules. They started to read the books they were given, initially as an intelligence exercise, a way to understand the enemy's mind. But they found themselves drawn into the stories, into the lives of characters who grappled with problems of love, ambition, and personal fulfillment, concepts that had been subsumed by the monolithic demands of the state in their own world. These narratives offered a glimpse into a society that valued the individual, a concept both terrifying and strangely alluring. The physical changes were also profound. With a consistent, nutritious diet, the gauntness left their faces, the hollows in their cheeks filled out, the dullness in their hair was replaced by a healthy sheen. Their bodies, no longer in a constant state of starvation and stress, began to heal. This physical recovery was itself a source of deep unease. They felt as though they were betraying their fallen comrades, their starving families back home, by growing healthy in the heart of the enemy's territory. The very wellness of their bodies felt like a form of treason. Akiko, who had once been wiry and sharp-edged like a shard of obsidian, found her own body softening. The change horrified her. She felt she was losing her edge, her warrior's hardness, and being remade in the soft, decadent image of her captors. She tried to resist it, secretly exercising to exhaustion in the dead of night, trying to maintain the harsh physical discipline that had always defined her. But the body has its own logic, a wisdom that is deaf to the demands of ideology. It craves nourishment, it seeks healing, and it responds to care. The women were trapped in their own healing bodies, their physical revival a constant, undeniable testament to the efficacy of the American system they were supposed to despise. They were living, breathing monuments to their own defeat. This created a schism between mind and body. Their minds still clung to the wreckage of their old beliefs, while their bodies thrived in the new reality. This internal war was, for many of them, more agonizing than the external one they had just survived. The enemy was no longer outside the wire fence. The enemy was the doubt in their own minds, the comfort in their own bellies, the health in their own skin. Their spirit, which they had believed to be invincible, was being conquered not by force, but by the simple, undeniable logic of a full stomach and a healed wound. It was a form of surrender so complete and so insidious that they didn't even know how to fight it. If you are moved by the depth of this human experience, a like on this video helps us reach a wider audience and share these important stories. The culmination of this slow-motion psychological siege was not a single dramatic event, but a quiet internal shift in perception. It happened one sweltering afternoon, months into their captivity. A supply truck had made its delivery, and as a special treat for a national holiday, Thanksgiving, a concept they vaguely understood as a celebration of harvest and gratitude, the camp was to be given a double ration of dessert. The women watched from their barracks window as the insulated containers were unloaded. There were dozens of them. A young guard, barely a man, dropped one of the heavy lids, and it clattered on the dusty ground. He laughed, and his friend playfully punched him on the shoulder. They were so casual, so utterly unconcerned by the monumental logistical feat they were a part of. And in that moment, the symbol of the ice cream crystallized in their collective consciousness. It was no longer just a food item. It was an artifact from a different reality, a totem of an incomprehensible power. Each spoonful they had eaten was a distillation of a vast, invisible system. It represented a dairy industry with millions of healthy, productive cows. It represented a sugar industry harvesting and refining on a massive scale. It represented a nationwide network of refrigerated transport, a marvel of engineering and logistics. It represented a chemical industry that could produce vanilla flavoring and stabilizers. It represented a manufacturing base that could produce the paper cups and spoons, the freezers, the trucks, all as a casual byproduct of its main purpose. The ice cream was the friendly, smiling face of an industrial leviathan so vast and so powerful that it could afford to turn its waste products, its surplus, its rounding errors into moments of pleasure for its captured enemies. This realization landed with the force of a physical blow. Their own nation's war effort was a desperate, all-consuming struggle that demanded the total sacrifice of its people. Every scrap of metal, every calorie, every ounce of energy was funneled into the furnace of war. For the Americans, it seemed, the war was just one of many projects, a massive undertaking that did not preclude the simultaneous production and distribution of frivolous luxuries. They had been fighting a nation that wasn't even trying its hardest. The thought was so profoundly demoralizing that it eclipsed everything else. It was the final, undeniable proof that their entire ideology, their belief in the supremacy of spirit over matter, was a catastrophic delusion. The spirit was a beautiful, noble thing, but it could not stand against a tidal wave of refrigerated, vanilla-flavored reality. Akiko stood at the window, her face pale. She was a brilliant strategist, a woman who understood logistics and supply lines. And in the casual clatter of that dropped lid, she finally understood the true nature of her enemy and the absolute finality of their defeat. The war had not been won on the beaches of Iwo Jima or in the skies over Okinawa. It had been won in the factories of Detroit, the farmlands of Iowa, and the dairies of Wisconsin. This simple desert was not a weapon of war, it was a declaration of a victory that had been assured long before they had ever shouldered their rifles. Stories like this remind us that the biggest battles are often fought within the human mind. Subscribe and join us for our next journey into the complexities of the human condition. In that silent, sun-drenched moment of revelation, the last pillars of their old world crumbled to dust. The emperor, the code of Bushido, the sacred mission of the Yamato race. It all seemed like a grand, tragic stage play performed on a sinking ship. They were the actors, and they had played their parts with passion and conviction, but the play was over, and the ocean was rising around them. The sense of purpose that had driven them, that had insulated them from fear and doubt, evaporated, leaving behind a cold, terrifying void. They were no longer soldiers of a divine empire. They were simply defeated women adrift in a foreign land, their entire lives revealed as a lie. The grief that followed was immense, but it was a strange, silent grief. They could not mourn for a cause they no longer believed in. They could not mourn for an identity that had been proven false. They mourned for their own lost innocence, for the years they had spent in service to a ghost. The end of the war was announced over the camp's loudspeakers a few weeks later. The words were almost an afterthought, a formal confirmation of a conclusion they had already reached in their own hearts. The guards celebrated with a quiet, restrained satisfaction, a stark contrast to the frenzied, suicidal fanaticism the women had been taught to expect from their own side in the face of victory or defeat. The gates of the camp were not thrown open immediately, but the atmosphere changed. The invisible barrier between captor and captive began to dissolve. They were no longer the enemy, but displaced persons, a bureaucratic term that perfectly captured their new state of being, unmoored, without a place, without a clear identity. The question of their future, which had been an abstract concept, suddenly became a pressing, practical reality. They would be repatriated, sent back to Japan. The thought of returning home, which should have been a source of comfort, was now a source of deep anxiety. What home were they returning to? A land devastated by firebombing and nuclear weapons, a nation humiliated in defeat and occupied by the very forces they now understood to be invincible. But more than the physical destruction, they feared the psychological return. They would be returning to the world of gammon, of noble suffering, of scarcity. They would be returning to the very ideology they now saw as a poison. How could they go back to believing the lie when they had tasted the truth? How could they explain their experience to their families, to a people who still clung to the old myths? They would be seen as traitors, their minds corrupted by the enemy. They would be aliens in their own land, haunted by the memory of a world where things were different, where life was not defined by the grim necessity of endurance. The idea of returning to a life without simple dignities, without the casual abundance they had come to witness, was unbearable. They had been captured and imprisoned, but in a strange and paradoxical way, they had also been liberated. They were free from the crushing weight of an ideology that demanded their subjugation and sacrifice. Now they were faced with a choice: a return to a familiar prison of the mind, or an uncertain future in the land of their captors, a land that had defeated them with kindness. Your engagement helps our channel grow. If this narrative provided a new perspective, please leave a comment below sharing your thoughts. We read them all. The process of repatriation began, and with it came a choice that few of them had ever anticipated. Due to the chaos in post-war Japan and a complex set of emerging immigration policies, Some prisoners, particularly those who could find sponsors or demonstrate specific skills, were given the option to apply for residency in the United States. For the women of the Ketsugo Butai, this was a monumental, life-altering decision. It was a choice between two different forms of exile: to be an outsider in their homeland or to be an immigrant in a foreign nation. For many, the choice was surprisingly clear. The America they had experienced, even from behind the barbed wire of a POW camp, represented a future. It was a place of astonishing, terrifying possibility. The Japan they had left behind was a graveyard of the past, a place of honorable ashes and bitter memories. Akiko Tanaka, the once unflinching ideologue, was one of the first to quietly begin the application process. The decision was an act of ultimate surrender, but also an act of profound personal courage. It was an admission that everything she had fought for was wrong, and a declaration of her intent to build a new life from the rubble of the old. She did not make the choice out of a sudden love for America, but out of a clear-eyed, pragmatic assessment of her options. She had seen the power of the American system, and she chose to align herself with it, not as a conquered enemy, but as a future participant. One by one, many of the other women followed her lead. Their shared experience in the camp, the collective shattering of their worldview, had forged a new kind of bond between them, stronger than the military discipline that had once held them together. They would face this new world not alone, but as a small, tightly knit community of survivors. The prompt's specific narrative comes to the forefront here. Many of them would go on to start families, not by assimilating and marrying American men, but by connecting with the existing Japanese-American community and Japanese men who, for various reasons, were also starting anew in the United States. This was not about abandoning their heritage, but about planting its roots in a new, more fertile soil. They sought to create a synthesis, a new identity that honored their past while embracing the possibilities of their future. They would raise their children to understand the virtues of gammon and duty, but also to appreciate the freedoms and opportunities of their new home. They became a bridge between two worlds, their lives a testament to the complex, often contradictory, nature of cultural exchange. Their journey was not one of simple assimilation, but of profound and painful adaptation. They were the quiet, forgotten legacy of a war that was decided not just by armies, but by the overwhelming, irrefutable power of a different way of life. The story of these women is a powerful reminder that history is not just a series of dates and battles, but the sum of individual human experiences and transformations. If you believe these stories need to be told, support our work by sharing this video with your friends and family. Your recommendation is our greatest asset. Decades later, long after the desert camp had been dismantled and reclaimed by the sand and scrub, these women would gather for reunions, their hair now grey, their faces softened by age. They would speak in a fluid mixture of Japanese and English, their conversations a tapestry woven from the threads of two cultures. They would tell their grandchildren stories, not of the battles they fought, but of the strange, quiet war they had lost and won in a prison camp in Arizona. And at these gatherings there would always be ice cream. It was a ritual, a quiet tribute to the moment their world had changed forever. For them it was never just a dessert. It was a sacrament. It was the taste of their defeat, the taste of their survival, and the taste of their unlikely, astonishing new beginning. The cold sweetness was a reminder of the bitter truth they had been forced to confront, that their nation had not been defeated by a superior army, but by a superior system of production, by a culture of abundance that they had been too blind to see. The shock they experienced was not just about the food or the good treatment. It was the shock of realizing that their entire reality was a carefully constructed fiction, and that the demons they had been taught to hate were simply people living in a world of unimaginable plenty. This realization did not come from propaganda or re-education, but from the simple, undeniable empirical evidence of their own senses. The Americans had conquered them without firing a shot, simply by allowing them to witness the mundane reality of their world. The conditions, the food, the drink, it was a systematic dismantling of their ideology, an assault of kindness and plenty that their spiritual defenses were not equipped to handle. The resulting shock was a form of psychological demolition, clearing the ground for something new to be built. The legacy of these women is not written in the grand annals of military history. It is a quieter, more personal story. It is the story of how a group of hardened soldiers forged in the fires of a fanatical ideology were utterly and irrevocably transformed by the simple, unexpected experience of human decency and material abundance. They had gone to war to defend their world, only to discover a new one that in the end they would choose as their own. Their decision to remain in the United States was the final, quiet verdict on the conflict they had survived. It was a testament to the fact that the most powerful force in the world is not always a weapon, but sometimes it is the undeniable evidence of a better life, offered in a simple paper cup.